Good day, everyone. My name is Alex Schadenberg. I'm the Executive Director of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, and we're doing an excellent opportunity for you today to listen to Alex Raikin talk about the research that has come out of Ontario about non-compliant deaths in Ontario. This is a significant issue, but it's also an issue that I'm sure affects all jurisdictions that allow euthanasia and assisted suicide. It's just that this is a very recent report with lots of information. And the reason I'm interviewing Alex and having Alex Raikin talk about it, he's really dug deep into the data, and that's quite good for all of us to have such a phenomenal researcher do that with us. So, Alex Raikin is a researcher who's been looking at these issues now for quite a while. So he's been published in major newspapers throughout North America, world, etc. And I can actually tell, he can probably tell you who he works with, and that may be easier. But I'm really impressed because he has that ability to really dig down into the data and separate it out. And some of these facts I'm going to ask him about first. 25% of all physicians who have done a May death in Ontario have been non-compliant with the law at least once. That was one of the data points. 428 cases of MAID in Ontario where the case was non-compliant with the law. And we're talking about between 2018 and the end of 2023. So obviously there'd be more cases in 2024, and there would have been the early cases too, which Alex has referred to in his research. So Alexander Raikin, please take over.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alex. And apologies for the fact that both of our names are apparently the same, but you'll have to make do with that. Yeah, so I'm a visiting fellow in bioethics and American democracy at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. That's also a little bit confusing just because EPC and EPPC are different organizations. But I promise this isn't like a Luigi and Mario type of situation. That said, yeah, I'm very happy to speak with all of you, and there will be questions afterwards. So yeah, let's just dive into some of these things. I did just want to mention just briefly that non-compliant euthanasia is a problem not just in Ontario. We've been hearing about this in Quebec, for instance, since the summer, and not just this summer, but as well from the very beginning. In Quebec in particular, there's an independent monitoring agency called the Commission des soins de fin de vie, which is tasked by Quebec's national parliament, because they like to be national, to independently monitor MAID in the province of Quebec. And they found, and the head of that commission, spoke to media last summer talking about how Quebec cases of MAID were approaching the limits of the law. But also there was a new innovation in Quebec, which is I haven't seen anywhere in the world, in any jurisdiction that reports assisted suicide, assisted dying, euthanasia, use whatever nomenclature you want, which is that when they break down in the annual reports on the underlying illness or disability that drives the MAID request, they actually have it's absurd, but they actually report the underlying illness as no illness, no grievous and irremediable illness that would have qualified under Quebec's law. Right, that is a reporting category in Quebec's annual MAID reports. Right, so if that's the clearest, I think that's the clearest you can possibly have that there is non-compliant euthanasia happening in Canada. But Quebec's independent monitoring agency, they have the ability to recommend further investigations, and they send further investigations to automatically to the police and to the colleges, but the medical college in Quebec declined to investigate a single one of those cases. Okay, so the independent monitoring agency is finding problems. Quebec isn't going further. Okay, why Ontario then? Well, Ontario is the only jurisdiction in Canada that monitors, that has an actual statutory obligation to monitor MAID, that is capable of thorough review. Because the Independent Commission in Quebec, as much as they're finding cases of quite blatantly, that blatantly do not follow, even theoretically, MAID deaths, Ontario tasked the Chief Coroner's Office of Ontario to investigate MAID cases. And that's important because the chief coroner is unique in the world, that they have the ability to compel evidence, they have the ability to conduct autopsies, and if you do not listen to the chief coroner's requests for information on any death, but especially on non-natural death, and that's an asterisk because in Ontario, MAID is considered to be a natural death, but it's also in some other places under provincial law considered like a non-natural death. So it's a little bit confusing, but just we'll put that aside. If you want to ask further questions, I'm more than happy to go into that. But what it means is that the Chief Coroner of Ontario is uniquely placed to be the only authority in Canada that is capable of actually providing oversight of MAID deaths. And that's why it's important to look at what is happening in Ontario, right? We do not hear about non-compliant euthanasia in most other jurisdictions in Canada on a systematic basis because there's no oversight being done. Quebec and Ontario are different. They had the longest oversight of any provinces in Canada, and that's why it's important to listen to what the Chief Coroner's Office has said.
Can
It's
I interject
also
1 second?
Yeah, feel free. Go ahead, of course.
I'm sorry to do this, but we know that British Columbia has a committee.
Yes.
So do you know the parameters of that committee? I'm just throwing this
Yes.
at you because it is
Yes. So
important.
British, yeah. So the reason why I didn't touch it is fair. British Columbia is the only other jurisdiction besides Ontario and Quebec to have had a long-standing committee. The problem with that committee is that the reports that we have is based off of providers' non-compliance. And we do have information on some of those, but we don't have information on whether violations actually happened. Okay, so that hasn't been released. We only know that there were complaints filed. We don't know if they actually went and crossed the barrier into violations. That's why Ontario and Quebec is different, because that information is available, right? Ontario and Quebec looked at cases. They had an independent agency, or at least with independent statutory powers, look into MAID deaths, find that there were things that were non-compliant, and issue a report or flagged a violation. Okay, this is why it's different. It's different than simply accusations of non-compliant euthanasia, which we've seen all across the world, all across jurisdictions. This is an independent monitoring agency who is finding violations and is explicitly saying that this crossed the line. Okay, this is why Ontario's case is so much different, and why I think this report, if I had to toot my own horn, I think is important. And especially what makes Ontario's case even more egregious is the fact that there are far more violations happening in Ontario than Quebec. Okay. In Quebec, I mean, so flagged by the independent agency, right? So in Quebec, there was always a problem of, well, how can we trust the data? Well, if we look at what the Chief Coroner's Office is finding, it seems to me that the commission in Quebec is underestimating the number of violations. Okay, so let's go into the Ontario report, and I would love to get questions afterwards. Alex, are you happy with what I said? Just to be clear, Alex is not paying me, but you are more than welcome to donate to his fine institution. Okay, so why this matters? Okay, so now that we know why Ontario is a good benchmark about finding, well, what is the natural amount of violations that happen? And I want to be clear, every single death, every single euthanasia that is non-consensual is a criminal violation in Canada. This isn't like any other part of healthcare where, for instance, if a physician fails to to follow all the protocols with something like a withdrawal of life-sustaining medical treatment, or applies a DNR and doesn't follow the regulations, unless it is very blatantly goes into criminal activity, it is most likely not a criminal violation. What makes euthanasia different is that under Canada's criminal law, right, Canada should have one of the strictest MAID programs in the world. Okay, under Canada's system, if you do not follow any of the safeguards, any portion of the safeguards or the eligibility criteria, you are breaking, which also includes failing to report a May death, failing to follow provincial guidelines. And there's an asterisk that there's a best faith argument in all of this, but we can put that aside and we can come back to that later. But under Canadian law, if you do not follow these criteria, you are not protected from the criminal immunity for culpable homicide and aiding a suicide, okay? Which means it's up to 14 years in jail. And the MAID providers all across Canada for years have said there's nothing to worry about. They said that the system is working. They said that there's no question over problems of oversight because the criminal compliance is so high. At the same time, the number of MAID cases that are being reviewed has dropped. And when I say reviewed, there's two different meanings, right? Every single MAID death in Quebec and Ontario has to be reviewed by either the Chief Coroner of Ontario or the Commission sur les soins de fin de vie. However, there's another step, which is once they send in these sort of preliminary documentation, there's the question of it actually, if the Commission is asking for further follow-up details, or the Chief Coroner's Office is following further follow-up details. At the 2018 annual convention for CAMAP, which is the Canadian Association of MAID Assessors and Providers, CAMAP described in their official summary that, quote, reviewing 43% of all MAID cases, so this is the secondary review process, is considered harassment by providers. Okay, so this was in 2018. In the early years in Quebec, reviewed after, yes. Yes, this is reviewed after, yes, sorry, but all of these cases are reviewed after the death has already happened, which is problematic because it's difficult to get some of the information on whether coercion has actually happened. And in fact, the Chief Coroner of Ontario, in one of his reports to CAMAP, actually explicitly said this. It's difficult to know if a patient has been coerced. Okay. In Quebec, so 43% of all May cases being reviewed was considered harassment. In 2023, in the fiscal year, it went from 43% in 2017 and 2018 to only 4% of MAID cases being reviewed for a follow-up review process in Quebec, while in Ontario, only 6% of MAID cases are considered for full review. Okay, why does this matter? It means that the actual oversight that is happening, maximal oversight, is only happening for a small percentage of total MAID cases. Okay, this means that the figures that's given, right, that the Chief Coroner of Ontario has found, 428 cases of possible criminal violations, to be all the more significant. The Chief Coroner's Office is only fully reviewing a small percentage of total cases. There is a strong possibility that there's other non-compliance happening. It's also important that this has been happening from virtually the very beginning of MAID. The Chief Coroner's Office already wrote an academic paper. It's a very bizarre academic paper because the primary author of that was an undergraduate student at the time. And he wrote this academic paper. I see people's eyebrows. It's a bit bizarre. So the only reason we even have this report is because of an undergraduate student. This wasn't publicly available any other way. Obviously, I have a strong suspicion that this was discussed privately. I would hope so, but there's no documentation to back that up. So I wouldn't go that far. But we have this public report. published in an academic journal with Dirk Hoyer, who was the chief coroner of Ontario at the time, and he still is the chief coroner of Ontario, and with another prominent pathologist, and with this undergraduate student, excuse me, it was an undergraduate student in the process of finishing her undergraduate degree. And in this report, it shows that even from the first 100 maid deaths in Ontario, there was quite prolific lack of compliance. Only 60, so remember when I said that every single safeguard, every single eligibility criteria has to be followed. This isn't my word. This is CAMAP's word. This is, Stephanie Green, who's the founding president of CAMAP. She has repeatedly said this. You look at any prominent maid provider in Canada, when they're testifying either in Canada or in the UK, they've all said the same thing. And yet, we find that in the first 100 euthanasia deaths, when you would expect that maid providers will be most diligently following the law, knowing that there's a 14-year possible prison sentence if they fail to uphold any part of it, surprisingly few number actually follow through with that. So only 61%, according to this academic paper, of maid providers reported to the chief coroner's office that they followed one of the safeguards, which is the safeguard that you had to inform a pharmacist the purpose of medication before you requested it, and you would administer it, right? This is an important safeguard in MAID. And this is from the very beginning of Canada's MAID program, because you want to make sure that lethal medication is not being is not falling through the cracks, right? So this is a written safeguard. If you don't knowingly follow it, you face prison sentence. You would think that maid providers would be following it. Only 61% admit, self-confessed that they were following it. The majority of the remainder said that didn't just refuse to answer that question, and then a small percentage, even self-admitted that they were not following that safeguard, right? So they reported themselves to the chief coroner's office saying that we did not follow the MAID protocol, right? And quite a myriad safeguard. So Heather has a good comment because they know they can get away with it. Obviously I can't read their inner thoughts, but it is quite distressing to know that. It's also distressing to know that other safeguards were not being followed, things like a 10-day minimum reflection period. A reflection period is essentially a waiting period. It's another Canadianism, like MAID. The point of and this is important. This is after the MAID has already been done. Yes. Oh, and yes. So multiple errors, and again, these are physicians and nurse practitioners self-admitting that they did not comply with the law. Another really important safeguard is that, so at the time, was that physicians had to wait 10 clear days between a patient request for MAID and then a patient dying through MAID. This was a safeguard that was recommended by the trial judge in the Carter decision, which the Supreme Court of Canada upheld, that there should be some delay between a request for an assisted suicide or euthanasia and actually dying through assisted suicide or euthanasia. That was the court's decision. And it was to Parliament to decide the exact number of days that would happen, or the amount of time. Under Canada's criminal law, it said that there was a 10-day minimum reflection period. And yet again, you have physicians who self-admitted that they did not follow that. And yet nothing happened. Also in 2018, there was a case of, a blatant case of, according to the chief coroner's office, of a physician who did not follow the law. Dirk Hoyer went to a group of nurse practitioners in one of their monthly meetings, and he told them that, quote, although rare, He said, we see a pattern of not following legislation, a pattern of not following regulation, and frankly, we can't just continue to do education to those folks if they're directly repeating stuff that we've brought to their attention. Okay. So also in 2018, so just some months prior to that, the Chief Coroner's Office sent out a memo to every single Ontario healthcare practitioner saying that there were that case reviews have found that here, I'll read this out, that some case reviews have demonstrated compliance concerns with both the criminal code and regulatory body policy expectations, which also is a requirement in the criminal code, but we'll sidestep that, some of which reoccurred over time. I mean, this already in 2018 is some of the most damning, commentary that you can have from the Chief Coroner's Office, right? That there are compliance concerns with the criminal code and which are reoccurring. And the response by Dirk Hoyer and the Chief Coroner's Office was to apparently just continue directly repeating stuff that his office has already brought to their attention. Now, these were public or quasi-public. Again, despite it being a memo sent to every single healthcare practitioner in Ontario, it wasn't exactly surreptitious. And yet, did any of you see that media reporting at the time? No. It wasn't reported in the news. It wasn't reported, more publicly than that. The Solicitor General of Ontario didn't issue that as a report. I couldn't find a single media account that actually addressed. And to make matters even worse, is the fact that the fact that Dirk Hoyer would go to a group of Ontario nurse practitioners who, again, are allowed under Canada is one of the only jurisdictions to allow nurse practitioners, not even physicians. I mean, they do great work, but they're not physicians, to administer and assess for euthanasia when nurse practitioners, by the way, are not allowed to prescribe things like, certain steroids, and yet they're allowed to prescribe euthanasia. And yet he went, Dirk Hoyer goes to these nurse practitioners, tells them quite explicitly that there's a pattern of non-compliance, and yet there's no other public statement beyond that, right? This is pretty damning information that the Chief Coroner's Office chose not to more publicly express. I should say that the Chief Coroner's Office in response said that they did send this to journalists and to other avenues. And yet I would just say that you should look up, the Chief Coroner's public-facing website. Even today, that 2018 warning is still up on the website. They updated to 2024, and yet even the subheading of his website talks about the review after the first 2 years, right? So they updated it with to comply with the further expansion of Maine and removal of like the 10-day waiting period, and yet again crickets. So this was the last public statement that the Chief Coroner's Office in Ontario made. This is very concerning, especially for the public health. But we did not hear a single thing beyond that. Then what we have is in 2020, which is so Dirk Hoyer gives a presentation to the Canadian Association of Maid Assessors and Providers and tells them these are the issues with compliance that his office found. And these are the same issues that he already flagged in just the first 100 euthanasia deaths. These issues were not insignificant, right? Like failing to, poor no completion of documentation or federal reporting requirements is a criminal offense. And yet some physicians did that, right? He's warning them that there's poor no completion of accompanying assessment notes. There's a problem with compliance with legislation, which again, the only legislation is a criminal legislation federally. And there's also provincial legislation, which you have to follow under Canada's criminal code. There's a problem with documenting maid deaths. that he found. And beyond that, there's also problems with like following the 10-day reflection period. And this was ultimately removed in 2021, partly because CAMAP would testify that this was, Stephanie Green, who at the time was the president of CAMAP, testified that it was a false safeguard. That it wasn't doing its job to protect patients. And turns out maybe part of the reason it was a false safeguard is because some physicians were not following that anyhow. But beyond just poor no completion of documentation, the chief coroner's office also found that there were patients who were potentially incapable of consenting to any healthcare procedure were apparently consenting to euthanasia. Right, so we're talking about potential non-consensual euthanasia happening in Ontario. His office found incompatible or contradictory conclusions of capacity by MAID assessors in comparison to other documented clinical assessments and medical records. Right, so think about what that means. Right, it means that a physician who has been found by another, yes, of course, Rachel, I'll just send my email. If you can. Okay, so I'll just send my email, and if you can just send that to me.
So it's fine, but yes, no problem.
I think it's eppc.org. Okay, if it goes, it might be eppc.com. I should definitely know my own email, but forgive me for that. Okay. But yeah, so this is very significant in terms of what the chief coroner's office is finding. It is. I hope I'm not I hope that I'm not making something into much more than it is. But I mean, when we're talking about incompatible or contradictory conclusions of capacity, that is concerning. I think it's concerning from a public health standpoint. I think it's concerning from a criminal perspective. I think that is, thanks. I should also say that English is not my first language. I grew up in a mixture of Russian, Hebrew, and then French, and finally English. So forgive me if I make any sense. That's the real miracle. I like to joke that I'm functionally monolingual because I feel like I know a quarter of each language. Okay, but let's go back to this. Okay. So this was in 2020. There was no public statement issued by the chief coroner's office. You think that he would have done a public follow-up the same way that what he did in 2018, and yet this wasn't done. Now, if you think that the problem was over after issuing this report to the Canadian Association of MAID Assessors and Providers, that is sadly not the case. In 2024, he found that, on the contrary, these issues have continued. In 2023 alone, there were 178 compliance problems. Okay, that is essentially one every other day. In Ontario, in total, it's 428 compliance issues. The problems, the problems have only, have clearly gotten worse. Some of the problems also included physicians not being able to follow a legally mandated safeguard, one of which is a 90-day waiting period. So under Canada's criminal law, because apparently a 10-day waiting period was a false safeguard, they got rid of that, but they added a 90-day minimum assessment period for non-terminal euthanasia. You would think that physicians would be following the law with this because it's very clear. It's under the criminal law. It's very clear what a minimum assessment period means, and yet this wasn't done. And sorry, I should also mention, I completely forgot to mention, there is also the blatant case of what the chief coroner was describing, which was also not reported anywhere by the media, which was a palliative physician who apparently didn't know anything about MAID. She apparently didn't even do anything like a cursory Google search. She went to one pharmacist, asked if she could get a prescription for MAID medication. She was denied. and told to go to like another pharmacy. And apparently she didn't do that. So what the palliative physician did is she took matters into her own hands, which is something that you definitely do not want to hear when we're talking about euthanasia. And she just used whatever medication she thought would kill the patient, which wasn't the case. So she used scopolamine and Ativan, which is not licensed for euthanasia anywhere. I mean, there's problems with main medication to begin with, but she didn't even follow any of the cursory searches. She didn't report the maid death because she apparently didn't know that there was a reporting requirement. I mean, she just decided to just kill a patient. The patient suffered, according to the chief coroner's office, both the family and the patient suffered tremendously. I mean, this is like breaking every single maid law that you could think of. The patient took at least 2.5 hours to die. And the way that we know that it was at least 2.5 hours is because that was how long the physician left the patient unattended. And just asked a family member to keep watch over the patient as she went to go get more medication. This is, you would think that something like this would have been brought to the public sooner, or would have been brought to the public at all. And yet it was not done so. It is, again, words kind of fail me. I mean, this is, the clearest example of clearly a non-consensual euthanasia. It's very difficult to, again, I'm obviously not a lawyer. Oh, yes, and the doctor's medical license. Okay, you would think that after this, her license would at least be suspended or revoked, or she would have to pay a fine to the family members. Oh, yeah, sorry, this was in Ontario. So this is the chief coroner of Ontario. That's one of the reasons why he spoke to the nurse practitioners. And yet, the only impact this had on this physician's license is that she was not allowed to assess or administer euthanasia, and and her palliative care needed to be supervised. She is still a practicing physician, or she is still a licensed physician in Ontario today. And not a single statement from the Ontario College of Surgeons and Physicians, not a single statement by any maid association, not a single statement by a solicitor general, not a single statement by the chief coroner's office of Ontario to the public. Okay, the public was not informed of one of the most egregious and clearly blatant violations of maid legislation anywhere. The patient and family suffered. There is great reputational harm, for patients. And I think the public has a right to be concerned when maid providers are not following the law as delineated, and they're only given a slap on the wrist. So when that case is not, oh, sorry, and beyond that, of all of those, so again, as Alex alluded to, right, that 1 in 4 maid providers in Ontario in 2023 were found of not complying with the maid legislation in some fashion. Not a single case has ever been recommended for charges by the chief coroner's office. Not a single case was ever recommended to the police. And a handful of cases were even recommended for the College of Surgeons and Physicians, of Ontario College of Surgeons and Physicians. And the only reason why we even know that this happened was because she was actually disciplined, at least somewhat. Most of the cases, we have no idea what actually transpired or what the ramifications were. Right, so there is quite a lot of just secrecy behind this. Even in cases which the Ontario College of Surgeons and Physicians are finding that the physician or nurse practitioner violated the maid legislation. One of the immediate impacts of like the New Atlantis reporting was that, just to give you another brief example, one of the eligibility criteria is that minors are not allowed to be euthanized in Canada. Hooray. Yet the coroner's reporting requirements was that he would, under the standard was that the coroner's office would not report potential euthanasia of a minor to the police. They were only going to report it to the College of Surgeons and Physicians, right? an immediate impact of this report is that Dirk Hoyer now says he would report if a minor was to be euthanized in Ontario, which we have no evidence that has happened, but he would now report it to the police. So hooray, we have that to look forward to, which obviously we hope will never happen, but that is the current situation that we find ourselves in. If you think this is disturbing, you are not the only ones. Two members of the MAID review panel group, which was formed by Dirk Hoyer to provide recommendations as in an advisory fashion to Dirk Hoyer's office on MAID. Both of them speaking as individuals, told me that they were concerned with this. That includes Dr. Ramona Calho, who wrote me by email that, quote, "It has been distressing to learn that some authorities, well aware of non-compliance with the law, did not publicly report them." And Trudeau Lemons also told me, and I'll just read this out, "In my opinion, any violation of the MAID law, considering that it's a criminal law, should be reported to the police and to the college as a matter of principle, and should certainly be investigated by an independent prosecutor. I don't know why that hasn't happened. It's a serious issue. I mean, this is a criminal law, and I'm worried that the lack of referring for prosecution and for investigation by the College of Physicians and Surgeons reflects a kind of normalization of MAID as some kind of inherent beneficial practice." And I think that is, I think that's probably a good time for questions. Alex, I'm happy to, is there anything else you would like to add?
Well, I was just going to point out that, as you know, this is not new. You mentioned about the first 100 cases in Ontario. Amy Hasbrook who was our president at the time of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, did a deep, in-depth research of the Quebec first reports. And I just pulled it up here. So this was a report that showed the data up until June 27th, 2017. And in that case, this is Quebec only. It showed that 90% of the cases respected the law, 90%. 10% did not. 3% it was because of insufficient information. 7% was because the cases simply did not comply with the law. So
can I jump in on that? So I think that's one of the more I think for physicians especially need to be aware of this, which is in the Quebec commissions in the Quebec Commission that investigates this. At first, what they did when they were looking at potential cases of noncompliance, they broke it down into 3 buckets. So the first bucket was MAID that complied with the legislation, and then the second bucket was cases where MAID was not compliant with the legislation. But they created that third bucket, which was 10% of all MAID cases, of where they were unable to determine if the MAID death complied with legislation. This obviously is disturbing. It's troublesome. This is a case where the public, I believe, has a right to know. And even from an oversight or a regulatory perspective, it's important to know if those deaths were actually compliant, and why they were unable to determine that. Well, in later years, they actually removed that third bucket.
That's right. No, I missed that. It was actually pretty early on they removed it because
yes.
Yeah.
But the reason that they did that is it forces them to assume that all MAID deaths are compliant unless otherwise proven, which is a very different barrier for evidence, right? It's not even about like a probabilistic, right? Like, based off the available evidence, if there's like a 50% plus 1% chance, that a May death was not following the law, then, this is probably not compliant. But instead, they just completely, they just remove that. And I think that's part of the history. Rachel says, "I love to hear First Nation or Métis or Inuit perspective," and David Milne had a good point. And Anita, I like most of the people here. Okay. But I did just want to say that there was actually, so first of all, there was testimony in a parliamentary committee that contained Indigenous perspectives. There was also an open letter by quite prominent Indigenous voices against assisted suicide. And this was part of a protest against expanding MAID to non-terminal euthanasia. This was the only collective letter by an Indigenous group or individual leaders. And it was against euthanasia. There's also the, Alex, feel free to correct me, but I believe it's called the Indigenous Disability Council,
Yes, of
which
course.
are also opposed on principle, especially for MAID for Track 2. I believe they're also opposed against MAID as a whole, but I'm not exactly sure about that. But they're 100%, and they're actually, I believe they're one of the named parties in
Correct.
the Charter Challenge
That's exactly part of
against
the
MAID
Charter
for.
Challenge.
But yes, so Indigenous group, the available evidence is Indigenous groups and Indigenous leaders, and especially the only Indigenous disability organization in Canada, are against MAID, especially for non-terminal euthanasia. And they're on the record. And the weakening of safeguards, including the 10-day reflection period, that was also removed in the same bill that expanded MAID for non-terminal euthanasia.
Yes. Now, the other thing about the Indigenous issue is that government should be really, really concerned with the fact that they really didn't consider the Indigenous people's perspective from the very beginning. And even when that issue came up around the time of 2021 with the expansion through Bill C7, they set up a bit of a committee to speak to Indigenous people, but they really didn't, how would you say, grant them a voice. It was more so talking to them,
Oh, yes.
more so pressuring them that maybe you should accept certain things. Like, it was really not a
Yeah.
hearing.
Oh, Alex is not overstating that case either. Like the questions was not, do Indigenous people, do they think that MAID is should be available in their communities, or do they believe, like, what are their actual views on MAID? The questions were written in such a way of, which are additional safeguards you would like, right? Or how do you think we should expand MAID to
That's right.
Indigenous groups, right? Like that is quite literally like the questions that were asked. Yeah, and what makes this even more egregious is that you can't even make this up. I mean, when there are negotiations, like treaty negotiations, the Supreme Court of Canada has quite explicitly said that it needs to be on a nation-to-nation basis. And yet this is a policy by the federal criminal system impacting vulnerable groups. Oh, sorry, okay, let me bring this up just because
Just so
I do
Rachel
just.
does have her hand up, so you can answer,
Yes.
then
Okay.
we have to.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Hi there, my name is Rachel. I'm a medical student and also want to be a clinical ethicist one day, planning to be a rural family doctor. This is not surprising that the government is talking at Indigenous people instead of listening. This happens all the time. I'm curious about two questions for you. What do you think is the purpose of healthcare? And then secondly, who is a person under the law, or who should be considered a person under the law? Because not everyone is treated like a person under the law. So just those two questions, I'd love to hear your answer, especially to the first one. What is the purpose of healthcare?
Yes, I mean, that is an excellent question. But first, just because we're talking about disturbing things, the 2018 annual convention for CAMAP, which again was only 2 years after MAID was legalized, actually discussed expanding MAID to Indigenous peoples. And one of which was a delegate who advocated, and again, I'm more than happy to send like the primary documentation, because I'll be honest, I didn't believe it when I saw it. But what a delegate advocated, and this was promoted by CAMAP, right? So this was a delegate chosen in their official summary proceedings. So this is a voice that we're trying to amplify. And this delegate advocated expanding MAID to Indigenous children, quote, because they're closest to the ancestors. So if you didn't expand MAID to Indigenous children, then you're effectively, being racist. That was the short gist of what they were arguing. And beyond that, there was a case study, again, just in 2018, right? This is one of the first MAID cases, which is which was the case of a First Nation patient whose suffering was exacerbated due to a life lived in poverty. And the MAID provider said that, it's possible that if they were provided with basic living circumstances, that they would not have applied for MAID. The response was by these MAID providers, and it is very different than what they said to a parliamentary committee, what they testified to a parliamentary committee, which I'll go into, but it's Stephanie Green, who again at the time was the president of CAMAP, quite explicitly said that if a patient is requesting MAID on the basis of a lack of resources, and they otherwise would qualify, we are not moving those cases forward. That is what Stephanie Green testified in CAMAP. But yet, at this official CAMAP proceedings with this First Nation patient whose suffering exacerbated due to a life lived in poverty, the response was, quote, "As soon as a patient tells me their suffering is enough, whether I like it, that is their situation and their context," right? So the answer is try to get their basic needs met, try to fix the system, but above all else, don't forget to kill a patient suffering from poverty, okay? This is just in the first 2 years of Canada's MAID program. And I think it's extremely important that when we get all of this annual reporting on MAID and the impact on vulnerable and Indigenous communities and racialized communities, that the reality on the ground is that you cannot simply look at the overall picture, the overall rates. That's not how we look at abuse, right? That is not how we look at prospective abuse or prospective discrimination or racism or things of that nature, right? You do not just look at what the overall rates are. You have to look at people's lives, right? And in this case, already in 2018, it's a very clear case of how MAID is applied in what seems like, again, there's no way to verify this, but this is being discussed by CAMAP in a very discriminatory fashion on the basis of poverty, and they knew this from 2018 in their official proceedings. Okay, sorry, Rachel, I completely forgot your question.
Again, she did ask you earlier what constitutes healthcare, but what's interesting about this, Rachel, I know this is not, I'm just, emceeing, but this law outside of Quebec is a criminal code law, not a healthcare. So it's a criminal code exception. It's an exception in the criminal code to allow a doctor or nurse practitioner to be directly involved with killing people. We call it MAID just to make us feel better. Yeah. So it's not technically even a healthcare question, but I think your question on healthcare is fundamental.
I'll speak to that if that's okay. So the answer that I give people, and you can quote me, you can quote my name or whatever. The purpose of healthcare is to promote health, to protect life, and to palliate suffering. We have to be very careful how we palliate suffering, though. And we can't justify certain things that do not protect life or do not promote health in order to palliate suffering. And so that's the answer that I give people all of the time. And so there's certain things that I won't do as a doctor because they don't fall within my primary duty is to protect health and promote bodily health and other kinds of flourishing too. And so that's the answer that I kind of give people. Something else I was going to say is I actually have a master's program in counseling.
London, Ontario, and be my doctor, and I'll be fine with you.
Oh, great, wonderful. Well, you'll have to move somewhere rural because I want to serve rural and Indigenous communities. So I also plan on being a surgeon too, because family doctors can do that. But anyways, I also have a master's in counseling psychology in a CAP accredited program, so I could be a registered psychologist in the College of Alberta. And
you're also told that you should come to PEI.
Okay.
So,
I train.
Yeah, go ahead.
I train at a suicide prevention course called CAMS, CAMS. It's about $100. It'll take you about 3 hours. Please do it. It will save a life. It instills hope. It instills problem solving. It figures out why someone's suffering, why they want to die. It's often, believe it or not, relational and occupational. Shockers has nothing to do with their bodily health, has nothing to do with their disability. It has to do with how their disability, how they are treated like persons or not. And sometimes people with disabilities are not treated like that. So I've asked my colleagues in second year medicine, and I've said, what will you do if you have a patient who says, I'm suffering, I want to die? They'll say, oh, we'll just refer them to the MAID team. They'll know what to do. I said, really? Because do you think it's the same thing to assess someone for a procedure to see if they can give informed consent versus to use suicide prevention skills and save their life? Because I think those are two very different things. When somebody is being assessed to see if they can go to surgery, that's very different than saying, hey, I'm with you. You are suffering a lot right now. And I want to know why. Please, can you tell me your story? And can we work together on this? That's very different. And I actually also studied hope. I did a huge paper about hope, and actually we can instill hope and it saves lives. And so I would love to talk about this too, but this is your talk. So we'll stop there, but I just think we need to be really clear about whose life we think is worth saving. Why is it that if you do not have a disability, we provide suicide prevention, but if you do have a disability, we provide suicide assistance? That makes no sense to me. So I'd love if someone can explain that.
Yeah, no, I think your points are very well considered. I think that I mean, that is a question that we're finding ourselves, right? What is healthcare in a world where MAID is normalized, and where if you have a disability, or if you have a low quality of life, that it means that you should not be able to receive the same level of medical care as someone who is able-bodied, and someone who who is younger. And I think that is a very fundamental question. We should definitely chat afterwards, because I think that how we define healthcare is actually, and how we define what a typical physician practice actually is very important in the US, over the next couple years. And I mentioned this before, but I'll mention it again. This isn't just a right versus left issue. This isn't just a pro-life issue. This is really this is really about a human issue. And I think that this is why this issue is still bipartisan. We see that both a Republican governor and a Democrat governor have vetoed assisted suicide bills in the US over the last year. We've seen how Republican and Democratic senators and representatives have issued joint statements against assisted suicide. And I really do believe that we need to reclaim healthcare, and we need to reclaim the dignity of the human being. And I think that that is definitely what the Ethics and Public Policy Center's mission is. And I think that it is something that we have to consider. But
yeah,
look,
I'm going to take my role as MC serious. Heather's got a question, and Anita wants to ask a question, and then we're done. Anybody who wants to send emails, we can share emails. That's fine. So Heather, you can unmute yourself, and then Anita will have a question, and then we'll be done. Thank you very much. Go ahead.
I don't know if it was a question so much as just a reaction or a response to, I mean, the whole question around how we determine the value of human life. I mean, there's a lot of really good points in the chat right now, but our society has been desensitized to death and desensitized to the value of life over the last 20 years. As a person with a disability, I've always been treated as less than human. Even as a child, I was told I should have died rather than be allowed to go to school and stuff like that. So this is a huge thing that needs to get hammered out. And yes, it is based on Judeo-Christian values. But this once was a Christian nation. It is no longer. So there's so many different kinds of streams of thought. And I mean, we've got the healthcare side of things. We've got the ethics side of things. You've got the faith side of things. And it's all being kind of snowballed into MAID, and that snowball's rolling downhill rather quickly and gathering up steam, because the reports that he's talking about are 6 years old, uncontested. So this has just been merrily rolling along for 6 years. So imagine what those numbers are today. It's crazy. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox now.
It's okay, Heather. Thank you. I think your point was well made. Anita?
Hi, this is Anita Cameron, and I am in the United States. And if y'all can see my face, you'll notice something very different about me than y'all. I am Black. I am one of the few people of color working in this, fighting against this. Let me say something about disabled people in this. The system isn't broken, it is designed to do that. We are seen as non-people, non-humans, and so there it is. How can we in the United States take this information and use it in our fight against us? We call it assisted suicide here in the United States, is what we call it. How can we take this information and use it in our fight in the United States?
Yeah,
There's
no,
the
I mean,
question.
your points are very well made. So let's be clear. You know, it is disturbing, right, Anita, that you are the only you know, Black disabled voice that is being listened to. I mean, you know, that is even has the potential to be listened to right now by policymakers. You know, Not Dead Yet is you know, Dan Coleman, who passed away earlier this month. I mean, I think she apologies. She said this best, right, when she you know, and the fact is, right, that it's not just assisted suicide, right? That's you know, you look at the history of DNRs, you look at the history of withdrawal of life-sustaining medical treatment. You look at the way that the healthcare system treats and views disabilities. And you know, I don't want to put words in her mouth, so I'll try, because I don't have her quotes right in front of me, but she has been absolutely one of the most moving voices about this, and I really hope that Not Dead Yet can be amplified in the U.S. To answer your question, it's a longer conversation. I would love to have that conversation with you. But there are quite a lot of opportunities about in this climate, right? In this, you know, now that you know, there's a Republican majority, what are different federal ways that we can continue this issue on a bipartisan nature? And I think that there are opportunities for this, especially in the U.S. I think that you know, the Canada's experience and how Canada, you know, and how MAID providers, as they describe themselves, how they view their work as so beautiful and eloquent, and how there are no issues. I think that just when you can show that to state legislatures, and also to like federal representatives and federal senators, and show them that this is happening and yet they're denying it, I think that has done a lot to explain why different governors have vetoed assisted suicide bills. But it is a longer conversation. I'm actually quite hopeful that in the US there can be more done on this front. And I think that we are now living in a moment where there can be pushback against this, and I'm quite optimistic. So it's a longer conversation. I'd love to have it with you. But I think the point of this is that there is no possible safe way to legalize assisted suicide, right? Assisted suicide is just the most toxic